Hello everybody, and thank you for joining today's session. I am Paolo Bugliani. I'm a visiting scholar at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing and an academic tutor and former research fellow in English literature at the University of Pisa. I am in Pisa today, and I'm very happy to be back after quite a long trip back home following last April's lockdown. Before I start, let me thank the Department of Philology, Literature and Linguistics for allowing me to get free access to some essential bibliographical material I needed to put the final touches to my paper. And of course for granting me the permission to record here, under the unblinking gaze of Mr. Darcy, who seems quite an appropriate and hopefully auspicious romantic presence. First of all, let me briefly lay out a sketch of the wider scope of my project at Oxford. My main goal is that of studying the romantic roots of Virginia Woolf's life writing. What I want to provide is a comprehensive panorama that could be linked to other modernist examples of reworkings and remediations of the same cultural heritage, as well as to her whole production as a writer and artist. Today I'll illustrate what constitutes the first step of my research at Oxford, that is the ideas that I formed around the romantic present and agency of the poetry of William Wordsworth on Woolf's autobiographical writings. I talk, of course, of the whole body of her autobiographical specimens that she constellated her writer's career with, from 1908, the years of the recollections, passing through the 1920s, Bloomsbury Ben Workshop contribution that is, although I think that a sketch of the past will have the pride of place, at least in today's talk. I chose today to deal solely with Woolf's autobiographical writings while leaving my ideas about her essays and biographies to a later moment. I made this choice not only for the sake of clarity and order, it does reflect a major shift in my research. If at first I thought that a comprehensive survey would be the case, I soon discovered that each life writing type has very specific features and requires separate attention. Divide and rule, as the Romans used to say. Therefore, I have eventually decided to start with the most challenging and thorniest specimen. Before dealing specifically with Wordsworth's presence in a sketch, I will provide some contextual information that I think is unavoidable. So now I'll start with my slides. I soon discovered that to pursue the aim of unearthing a romantic modernism entails a polemical attitude. An apparently strong bias against romantic aesthetics is in fact one of the most widely recognized features of the modernist movement. Perhaps this tendency is nowhere so completely embodied as in T.S. Eliot's dual capacity of poet and critic, namely in the refusal of the confessional introspection representing the core of his impersonality credo. He articulated his dislike in such iconic essays as 1919 Tradition and the Individual Talent, or even more diffusely in the simple chapters of The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism in 1930. And not to blame Eliot alone, one can easily perceive this anti-romantic trend as a generalized trait of early 20th century European literature. Paul Valéry, Milan de Unamuno, Eugène Montale all articulated their aesthetical views in a more or less belligerent attitude towards early 19th century literary modes. In its Anglo-American dimension, such an outlook was strongly influenced by the work of such conservative critics as T. Hume and Irving Babbitt, who tended to equate romanticism with political radicalism, as Christoph Hadian argues in detail in his monograph Conservative Modernists. Hume in particular had provided modernist anti-romanticism with a significant milestone pronouncement, where he described romanticism as a proper disease of the soul. To uphold a romantic perspective is, for him, I quote, like pouring a pot of treacle over the dinner table. Romanticism, then, and this is the best definition I can give of it, is spilled religion. Hume's ideas had a considerable influence on young T.S. Eliot, whose later poetics had been canonized by new critics into an anti-romantic critical practice which has been, in turn, largely responsible for the perception of modernism as an anti-romantic movement. Yet, things are predictably much more complicated than textbook formulae might let to assume. Already in the 1930s, Aldous Huxley, for one, underlined the futility of such an anti-romantic obstinacy in an essay entitled The New Romanticism, where he very ironically demonstrated how Romanticism's most fierce detractors, who were conservatives, moralists, and avant-garde experimentalists, were in fact driven by this very same intent that had guided the Romantics a century before. Pots and kettles, he wrote, may quarrel, but their quarrel is proverbially the same. Most of the enemies of Romanticism are, in their own way, as extravagant and one-sided, that is to say romantic, as the Romantics themselves. Huxley's stance helped us envisage modernism as a period which was passed through by many conflicting currents, some of which are nowadays perhaps less evident, but are nevertheless fruitful components of the wide panorama of early and mid-20th century letters. In the artistic field, for instance, the 1930s saw the insurgence of a proper new romantic movement, founded by such critics as Raymond Mortimer and Herbert Reed. Intended primarily as a reaction to the dehumanization of Cubist and avant-garde artistic trends, New Romanticism has become the subject of a beautiful book-length essay by Alexandra Harris, entitled Romantic Moderns, where she discusses the artistic activity of some artists she labels as experimental antiquarians, whose most blatant feature is a tendency to recuperate English early 19th century literary and artistic heritage as a source of literary inspiration, in order to dam the disarray provoked by such disruptive early 20th century artistic currents. Despite having been an artistic phenomenon rather than a literary one, Andrew Radfield follows suit in retrieving Neo-Romanticism and employing it in his very recent study of unjustly neglected modernist Mary Butt's eccentric evasion from mainstream ideas of modernism. Mine, though, is a more textually oriented project. I wanted my research to fall within the boundaries of what is generally referred to as the study of literary heritage. In other words, the element that aroused my interest about Romantic Woolf, or if you prefer, of Woolf as a romantic modern, is how she built up and cemented a relationship with her literary ancestors. Following the idea of presence she introduced in the Modern Essay in 1922, I have decided to explore her relationship with her own literary fathers and forefathers as a proper acquaintance, with two principal goals in mind. On the one hand, I intend to portray her looking back and engagement with English romantics as a schismatic practice, vis-à-vis mainstream Eliotian standards. Hers can be perceived as a decisive act of dismantlement of dominant narratives, even if, maybe paradoxically, it entails a backward glance. On the other hand, I want to use her example in order to retrieve an image of modernist engagement with tradition not in the Bloomian sense of Oedipal, anxious confrontation, but rather in an overwhelmingly positive light. To do so, I borrow Christopher Rick's idea of allusion, to be able to craft a complex, sort of layered idea of the relationship modernism established with the literary past. A new picture where Eliot's unquiet grave for the burial of the dead is put next to more irenic rites of passage, where collaboration and accretion are paramount. Bearing the anti-romantic context and the theoretical framework of allusion in mind, the next step in my research was to look for evidence. Rather than aiming at spotting internal allusions, I prefer to start from the external evidence. Just by a quick perusal of the Palgrave Critical Heritage volume on Woolf, one finds that the word romantic appears 23 times. And if also derivatives are included, the counter goes well beyond 70. It seemed thus unquestionable that the issue of Woolf and Romanticism had been a recurrent concern, at least for her earlier readers. What is peculiar of this penchant for romanticism is, I am afraid, an obtruding gendered bias. Romantic was of course used by critics both as a specialized critical label referring to the literary movement, but also, in many instances, it retains a more general connotation of fanciful, sentimental, idealistic. Even a sympathetic reader such as Lytton Strachey could fall victim to such a bias. In a letter he sent Woolf after reading Jacob's Room, in which he celebrates the novel as a success, of course, he had also a final reserve that sounds like a half-heartedly confessed concern. He wrote, "Of course you're very romantic," which alarms me slightly. I am such a bonhomie. Once or twice I thought you were in danger of becoming George Meredithian in style. Or was that a delusion? Something of the sort certainly seems to me the danger for your genre. But so far you're safe. You're a romantic in Cyrus, I fancy, which after all is a good way off from Box Hill. Here, romanticism qua sentimentalism is evoked, be it connected with the late 19th century novels by George Meredith or with Jane Austen's heroines. It seems as if Strachey was worried the Woolf novelistic medium encouraged her to aestheticize her own feelings and intimate emotion in a manner unbefitting serious literature. A less idiosyncratic and, at least in intention, frank appraisal of Woolf's romanticism is to be found in Raymond Mortimer's 1926 London letter. Mortimer, one of the new romantic art critics I mentioned before, was also a younger member of the Bloomsbury group, and offered his own account of that intellectual set. Although he saw Bloomsbury leaders as prone, I quote, to exalt the classical in all the arts, he maintained that already the signs of a romantic revival are everywhere perceptible, claiming that obviously there is a romantic poet in Mrs. Woolf, a mystic in Mr. E.M. Forster, whereas Mr. Strachey, for all his appreciation of Blake and Beddoes, remains in his outlook almost a contemporary of Voltaire. Mortimer's judgment is noteworthy because it depicts Bloomsbury as a dissonant voice, and his mention of Woolf's romanticism seems to suggest that such an ingredient was crucial to the group's revolutionariness. Another impartial mention of Woolf's romantic side is Edwin Muir's 1926 review essay, where he praised Woolf's art as, I quote, less akin to anything else attempted in the novel than to certain kinds of poetry, to poetry such as Wordsworth's, which records not so much a general judgment of life as a moment of serene illumination or a state of soul. We can easily appreciate how Mortimer's and Muir's remark markedly turn away from an impressionistic stance, such as Strachey's, to a more critically sound perspective. Such line has been pursued in contemporary time by Hermione Lee, whose work is at the very basis of my own research. Her statement that Woolf was deeply and consciously affected by patterns of thought and by the language of the Romantic writers is everywhere apparent, should foster a more profound and sustained interpretative effort in that line. Although several other studies have appeared in the last years, still no systematic perspective has been provided for this crucial feature of Woolf's art. Turning back to Muir for a second, I wish to call attention to the Wordsworthian features he detected, which are in fact those that I specifically intend to pursue. I believe in fact that the crucial relationship between Wordsworthian spots of time and Woolfian moments of being should lie at the core of Woolf's engagement not only with the past, but also with our idea of the literary representation of time past in life writing. To put it differently, I want to pin down the Wordsworthian element in her autobiographical efforts. These momentous occasions of highlighted experience of time, intended as sacral epiphanies of the utmost importance, may of course be effortlessly associated also to other modernist writers and their approaches to temporality. Let us just recall Joyce's Epiphanies, Mansfield's Blazing Moments, Montales occasioni, Proust's intermittence du cœur. What is to be stressed here, however, is how modernist ideas of the individual experience of time may have been in fact the result of the exposure to romantic tradition. The same high modernist priests like T.S. Eliot and company were so keen to disavow. Even though some critical efforts have been made to bring this romantic feature to light, I believe that the connection is still perceived as debatable by many. While I think that this joint perspective, that is, Wordsworth's influence on Woolf in the subject of memory, can do much for a clearer delineation of both authors' critical profiles. The prime goal of my analysis of Woolf's Wordsworthian roots is that of assessing how his philosophy of the spots of time affected her own view of the memorial acts at the base of any type of life writing. As this was an Oxford Centre for Life Writing project, I couldn't help trying to figure out how my later contribution might also be inserted into a wider discussion on autobiographical practices, and in particular in the uneven and sometimes rough terrain of modernist autobiography. So, relying among others on Laura Marcus's recent contribution to the history of English autobiography, I have decided to study Woolf's life writing in a way that could also be of some interest to a wider historiographical discourse on the fall. As we now have finally abandoned, I quote Marcus, long-held assumptions that the genre of autobiography did not flourish in the context of modernism, we should begin to praise attempts, such as Woolf's, to craft a proper medium to retrieve on the page, I quote Marcus again, the fleeting, evanescent and fluid qualities of identity and experience. Woolf's own autobiographical acts are thus to be taken as literary sites in which theoretical speculations and aesthetic concern do not clash, but rather concur in an experimental search for a balanced way of portraying the bodily and mental experience of the subject in time. One way in which my project distances itself from the general assumptions about Woolf's autobiographical endeavour is that I rather focus on the philosophy of the recollecting act than on the phenomenology of the things recollected. My critical lens privileges, in other words, her conscious literary strategies of addressing and retrieving the past rather than the actual content of her memories. If we consider, for example, the many meta-literary asides in both Reminiscences and A Sketch of the Past about the difficulties of writing a good memoir, we cannot fail to appreciate how these specimens were meant by their author as an arena where to figure out how should one write one's own memoir, and not simply as a confessional outlet. I firmly believe, in other words, that Woolf was seeking after a positive type of autobiography, and not merely a denunciation of Gerard Duckworth's abuses of Leslie Stephen's patriarchal despotism. She was, after all, plunging in Freud's writing at the time she wrote A Sketch, and I think that life writing could be considered a sort of healing practice that fostered what Gabrielle McIntyre labelled as a persistent return of what we may call a positivity in the midst of trauma, a rediscovering of plenitude, of being precisely at the moments when one seems most divested of being. This positive goal takes me back to Wordsworth. His acts of recollection are invariably connoted as irenic epiphanies, where the recollection is retrieved on the page in order to be transformed into a textual entity with a restoring power over the individual consciousness. As a matter of fact, I believe that Woolf, a great admirer of her literary forefather's autobiographical poem The Prelude, borrowed from him a structuring principle for the arrangement of her own memories on the page, one that Wordsworth devised in Book 11 of The Prelude, where he framed two of his early childhood memories within an orderly philosophical scheme based on what he calls spots of time. The lines, I think, are self-explicative and hardly need any further comment. There are in our existence spots of time which with distinct preeminence retain a renovating virtue, whence, depressed by false opinion and contentious thought, or out of heavier and more deadly weight in trivial occupation and the round of ordinary intercourse, our minds are nourished and invisibly repaired. A virtue by which pleasure is enhanced, that penetrates, enables us to mount when high, more high, and lifts us up when fallen. This efficacious spirit chiefly lurks among those passages of life in which we have had the deepest feeling that the mind is lord and master, and that our outward sense is but the obedient servant of our will. Such moments, worthy of all gratitude, are scattered everywhere, taking their date from our first childhood. In our childhood, even perhaps more conspicuous. In the preceding books, the prelude featured a lot of different recollections, but only in Book 11 is a systematization of memory felt as necessary. The feeling we get is that of a quest for a label, an organizing principle that Wordsworth articulates in 2 books dedicated, it is no coincidence, to the faculty of imagination. A very similar frame is provided in A Sketch of the Past. Woolf jots down a series of memories without actually choosing any unifying principle of arrangement, except for the chronological disposition provided by dates, until she isolates a third set of memories, a fight with her brother Toby, the flower bed in St. Ives, and her overhearing of the suicide of a certain Mr. Volpe. At this point, she inserts a digression where, similarly to Wordsworth's spots of line stanzas, she produces and muses upon a label of her own, the moments of being. The descriptive pause speculates on the reason why some of her memories stand out from the indistinct mass of her past. I only know that many of these exceptional moments brought with them a particular horror and a physical collapse. They seem dominant, myself passive. This suggests that as one gets older, one has a greater power, through reason, to provide an explanation. And that this explanation blunts the sledgehammer force of the blow. I think this is true, because though I still have the peculiarity that I receive these sudden shocks, they are now always welcome. After the first surprise, I always feel instantly that they are particularly valuable. I feel that I have had a blow, but it is not, as I thought as a child, simply a blow from an enemy hidden behind the cotton wool of daily life. It is, or will become, a revelation of some order. It is a token of some real thing behind appearances, and I make it real by putting it into words. It is only by putting it into words that I make it whole. This wholeness means that it has lost its power to hurt me. From this, I reach what I may call a philosophy. At any rate, it is a constant idea of mine, that behind the cotton wool is a hidden pattern, that we, all human beings, are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, and that we are part of the work of art. The similarities are indeed striking. In addition to the specific reference to childhood, Wordsworth's idea of the mind as lord and master is echoed by Woolf's remark on how, as she got older, she became more and more able to provide a rational explanation and range these exceptional moments in order. Wordsworth's image of sense as the obedient servant resounds in the passivity Woolf feels when visited by her own moments. Last but not least, Woolf's final reference to a philosophy of her own concerning the act of sketching the past can effectively be read as an attempt to organize memories according to a value principle that should underline and make the text hinge upon those which possess a power to retrieve and express the mystical experience of being. Without indulging in too much speculation, I would like to highlight that these moments have, in both writers, an epistemological value, and both authors take significant pain to stress how their perceptions contribute to a fuller outlook on their speculative goal, which is ultimately life. I should now go back to my prime aim for investigating the mechanisms of literary heritage. In fact, after spotting Wordsworth's presence, it was mandatory for me to try and answer the question, whose Wordsworth was Woolf working with? This is crucial, I believe, to understand what Woolf's idea of romanticism was. First of all, I needed to get a sense of Woolf's reading options. I'm afraid I feel the need to start with some tedious editorial information. So Leslie Stephen's library, which Virginia inherited in 1904, featured Morley's 1902 Macmillan Complete Edition, and she could also rely on the Moxon 1850 posthumous prelude, arranged by Wordsworth Whitgill according to later life revisions and excisions by the poet, who progressively blurred the dialogical nature of a piece crafted as a conversational piece on human consciousness in 1798, addressed to Coleridge. Matthew Arnold, the most famous 19th century Wordsworthian editor, followed this de-philosophizing involution and decided to remove all traces of philosophical poetry in the 1979 Golden Treasury Macmillan anthology he edited with the prime aim of celebrating Wordsworth's stature as a poet and a poet only. The philosophical framework of memory arrangement by spots of time was to be restored in 1926 by Ernest de Senancourt in his critical edition of the 1805 Prelude, a text which is more faithful to Wordsworth's initial idea of a dialogical poem, title not yet fixed upon, addressed to Coleridge. It is true, though, that even before the Senancourt edition, Woolf had full cognizance of Wordsworth's philosophical stature. Leslie Stephen had been one of the first supporters of Wordsworth's philosophical powers, and he laid out his views in an orderly fashion in an 1867 essay entitled Wordsworth Ethics. As the title suggests, Stephen did portray Wordsworth as a philosopher, yet his philosophical prowess he confined to an ethical goal. Wordsworth was for him essentially a moral guide. His views on morality as a prerequisite of poetical excellence are unequivocally and stentoriously stated from the very beginning of the essay. A good philosopher, he maintained, may be an execrable poet. Even stupidity is happily not inconsistent with a firm grasp of ultimate principles. But the vigor with which a man grasps and assimilates a deep moral doctrine is a test of the degree in which he possesses one essential condition of the higher political excellence. A continual illustration of this principle is given in the poetry of Wordsworth, who indeed has expounded his ethical and philosophical views so explicitly that a great part of the work is done to our hands. Woolf seems to reiterate some of her father's ideas when she, for instance, referred to Wordsworth as a writer-priest in the Paston and Chaucer essay. But I need not specifying how she worked her whole life to fashion an aesthetical system of her own, freed from the too rigid intellectual imposition of her father. So I think that we should broaden the sources, and I think that Woolf was familiar with other possible critical responses to Wordsworth, and there is one in particular that I think is extremely important to uncover. I am talking of Walter Pater. The Wordsworth distinctly echoes through the conclusion to the Renaissance is hardly disputable, and Pater definitely figures among Wordsworth's most acute commentators. Pater's appreciations can be considered a proper primer for the study of Romanticism, offering not only single author studies on, for example, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Charles Lamb, but also a general view of Romanticism as a phenomenon which was more of an ever-present, enduring principle, whose distinctive literary traits constituted symptoms of a very continuous and widely working influence. Coherently with such a general view of Romanticism, his 1874 essay on Wordsworth is primarily focused on an appraisal that also takes into consideration Wordsworth's philosophical prowess, but with nothing of the moralistic tone of Stephen, rather focusing on the pantheistic drive of his thought. Pater had a very classicized view of Wordsworth, yet he did not fail to underpin the modernity inherent to the spots of time, as heightened moments of consciousness. He has a power likewise of realizing and conveying to the consciousness of the reader abstract and elementary impressions, silence, darkness, absolute motionlessness, or, again, the whole complex sentiment of a particular place, the abstract expression of desolation in the long white road, of peacefulness in a particular folding of the hills, in the airy building of the brain. A special day, or hour even, comes to have for him a sort of personal identity, a spirit or angel given to it, by which, for its exceptional insight, or the happy light upon it, it has a presence in one's history, and acts there as a separate power or accomplishment. And he has celebrated in his poem the efficacious spirit which, as he says, resides in these particular spots of time. I believe that passages such as these were the ones that Woolf would have found the most attuned to her own reading of such passages in Wordsworth. Yet, Pater's influence in the development of Woolf's craft has so far been a rather thorny subject, and I must thank Stefano Evangelista for helping me to better focus on this issue. As Perry Meisel's monograph The Absent Father documents, Pater was a writer and thinker most at odds with Woolf's intellectual milieu. When she was still Miss Stephen and homeschooled by her father, Pater could not find a place as an officially required reading, though he was present in the library. His aestheticism and cult of beauty were most discordant with the patriarch's views, as Virginia acknowledges in a sketch. Such a Spartan, ascetic, puritanical figure who possessed no feeling for picture, no ear for music, no sense of the sound of words, impaired the natural love of beauty, checkering it with an ancestral dread. When Virginia became a member of the Bloomsbury set and thus no longer under the spell of the eminent Victorian, her Poterian attitude was hindered again by the male member's proclivity to either a more politically oriented standard, with Leonard in the lead, or a speculative vein that rather followed G. Moore's Cambridge ethos of phenomenological inquiry. My contention is that Pater's Oxonian aesthetics of romanticism, so coherently exposed in appreciations, furnished an alternative that, when rightly illuminated, could shed light on her multifarious intellectual prowess that far exceeded the frames of Bloomsbury or Anglo-American modernist frames of mind. As you can see, I aim to construct what I think is going to become at least a couple of essays on this recuperation of romantic heritage as a multi-layered phenomenon, far exceeding the textual level of citation, but exploiting the higher implication of allusion and intertextuality in order to retrieve a picture of Woolf as a life writer who has internalized not only the romantic poet's lesson, but also all the relevant intellectual debate around it. The gain from such a studious process of appropriation is manifold. A wider and more layered idea of romanticism could be perceived at work in many other literary domains, from essay writing to reviewing, but perhaps most interestingly in fiction. We all know that Woolf's fiction has strong autobiographical connections, as indeed has Wordsworth's poetry. Without claiming here that biographical elements should constitute the core of the analysis, I want to illustrate a concluding instance in which a biographical element has illuminated, as a sort of retroactive confirmation, my whole argument. I assume every one of you has read Slater's Pins Had No Points, one of the finest short stories in the modernist period, and perhaps in the whole of the 20th century. Personal appreciation, please accept it. Who's amongst you remember the story could hardly have missed that Miss Grey is in fact based on Clara Pater, Walter's sister who had been Virginia's first classics private tutor. The heroine of this nice little story about Sufism is not only a fictional embodiment, but more crucially for my research project, a vehicle of a moment of being. It is not a case that the title of the short story in the 1941 posthumous collection, A Haunted House, was transformed by Leonard in Moments of Being, Slater's Spin Have No Points. As a matter of fact, the young protagonist witnesses a moment of ecstasy in Miss Grey at the very end, in which that stiff and solidified figure is liberated from bodily constraints and is able to embody the full power of the moment of being. Fanny Wilmot saw the pin on the carpet. She picked it up. She looked at Miss Grey. Was Miss Grey lonely? No. Miss Grey was steadily, blissfully, if only for a moment, a happy woman. Fanny had surprised her in a moment of ecstasy. She sat there, half turned away from the piano, with her hands clasped in her lap, holding the carnation upright, while behind her was the sharp square of the window. Julia Cray, sitting hunched and compact, holding her flower, seemed to emerge out of the London night, seemed to fling it like a cloak behind her. It seems, in its bareness and intensity, the effluence of a spirit, something she had made which surrounded her, which was her. Fanny stared. All seemed transparent for a moment to the gaze of Fanny Wilmot, as if looking through Miss Grey. She saw the very fountain of her being, spurt up in pure silver drops. She saw Julia. Clara Pater, as Miss Grey, becomes a special type of intellectual vehicle. Among all these all-grand men of letters, she can become a less intruding pedagogical influence that Woolf could mould in her fiction, and that was perfectly amphibious. She taught her in the domesticity of Hyde Gate 22, thus in accordance with her paternal pedagogical regime, and yet she brought with her that flame that was the very core of her brother's doctrine. She was the perfect transparent surface on which Woolf was free to project her ideas about the past and its relationship with the present. The same globular and semi-transparent canvas on which she wanted to paint her memories at the beginning of A Sketch of the Past. To draw my talk to a close, I wish to stress the importance of the relational element in Woolf's engagement with the literary past, which I think will constitute the leitmotif of all the other romantic presences quests which I'm about to pursue in the near future. As the case of Pater illustrated, romantic presences do not hang in void, but are always rooted to an intellectual debate that needs to be carefully reassembled. My next step would be that of retrieving the presence of Charles Lamb, one of the romantic essayists Woolf cherished most intensely, and an author with which I too have a special connection, because it was the subject of my PhD dissertation. Woolf wrote frequently of Lamb's essays, but perhaps his most important appearance is in her manifesto of essay writing, The Modern Essay, where he is celebrated as one of the best practitioners of such a genre. I think that it will be very interesting to assess who were the intermediaries that helped Woolf to adapt such a typically romantic form to modern times. And now, I wish to thank you all for your attention and patience, and most importantly, I am eager to hear all your comments, ideas, suggestions, and opinions. As I told you, my project is still in the making, so please feel free to share any type of feedback, because I found that when dealing with life writing, ocular discussions never fail to illuminate new possibilities. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I hope that we'll be able to meet again very soon and to talk in person about modernism, romanticism, Woolf, and everything in between.